In this era of environmental awareness and urgent quest for sustainability, the US Inflation Reduction Act and the European Net Zero Industry Act have emerged as key pieces of legislation aimed at transforming the industrial sector into a hub for green innovation. Domestic production of renewable energy and energy efficiency equipment can be a key contributor to greater resilience. Which role can it play in a globalized world?
Welcome back, everyone. Great to have you with us. It has been a very productive, very intensive, and also long day, so I'm very grateful that so many of you are still with us, hopefully also online. In our Latin American Caribbean session just now, we talked briefly about industrial policy. In this panel, we want to take a deeper dive. As countries seek to balance the urgent goals of energy security and climate sustainability, initiatives such as the US Inflation Reduction Act and the European Net Zero Industry Act have emerged as tools for reindustrializing economies through green innovation. And that puts a spotlight on domestic production of renewable energy, along with products aimed at boosting energy efficiency as a means to greater resilience and autonomy. The EU and the US are racing to boost onshore manufacturing, and we want to ask where that leaves other nations and regions. Is incentivizing domestic production feasible and sensible in a globalized world? And how can a robust green industrial sector be fostered worldwide? Those are some of our guiding questions for this panel, and we have a fantastic group with us to address them. Starting here, I introduce with pleasure Laura Lockman. She is Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy in the United States Bureau of Energy Resources. She's a career member of the Senior Foreign Service and has served in multiple high-level overseas assignments. Great to have you with us. And then I am jumping over to the opposite end of the panel. Dr. Gerd Müller is Director General of the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. He's a very welcome returning guest. Previously served as Germany's Federal Minister for Economic Cooperation and Development, as well as is a member of the European Parliament. And coming back to this side of the panel, Jean-Marie Pogam is Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. He, too, is a very welcome returning guest. He previously represented France at the WTO and has also held senior leadership positions in international finance with the French Treasury and the UN system. Joanne Bate is Chief Operations Officer of South Africa's Industrial Development Corporation, responsible, among other areas, for industry planning in alignment with the government's Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, and also for green hydrogen and new energy vehicles. Great to have you with us. Thank you for being here. And in the middle, Dr. Ajay Mathur is Director General of the International Solar Alliance, an intergovernmental organization that promotes solar energy in 114 member countries. He previously served as Director General of India's Energy and Resource Institute, TARI, and as a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change. Thank you also for joining us. Let us begin once again, ladies and gentlemen, with an audience poll. Actually, this is a word cloud question in this case. Please take your mobile devices and go to our Slido website using the barcode you see here. And very simple question: which are the main drivers for a robust green industrial sector worldwide? Worldwide. So please write in whichever word or words occurs to you, and we'll come back and take a look in a little while. Meanwhile, I'd like to do a first round of discussion aimed at an overview of actions to boost the green economy. And I'll start here, if I may, with you, Laura Lockman. And President Biden, we heard it recently in his State of the Union address, definitely sees the IRA as one of his biggest successes. He declared that his administration has taken the most significant climate action in history, in fact. So tell us concretely, how is the law shaping the clean energy economy in the US? What's been the impact so far?
Great. Thank you very much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here at the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue and to speak on these issues, particularly in the wake of a very successful COP last year, at which we all agreed that we need to be moving as fast as possible to build up our clean energy supply chains and systems. And to realize the future that we have imagined, we need to diversify and fortify, expand our supply chains in the clean energy technology space. We know that this is an enormous task, and the United States understands that we need to take strong domestic action in this regard, and then also cooperate very significantly with other parts of the international community. And we all need to think about what targeted public investments are needed to crowd in the private sector investments. We need certainty as well in these public sector approaches so that business has the security that it needs to invest sufficiently in supply chains. And this is really the philosophy that's at the heart of several pieces of U.S. legislation, most significantly the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, also the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, and the CHIPS and Science Act as well. They contain incentives for manufacturing across the clean energy supply chain, as well as investments in demonstration projects, loans and loan guarantees for a variety of technologies, and production and investment tax credits, which is the biggest part of what we're doing under the IRA. And this has really supercharged the United States on its path to building and strengthening its supply chain and moving towards a clean energy economy. So it gives 10 years of certainty for business, and companies can really plan for the long term. So what's happened so far? Estimates indicate over 210,000 jobs have been created in the 18 months since the IRA was passed, and that there's a potential for 1.5 million jobs created over the entire 10-year period. In addition, over $224 billion in investments in clean energy investments have been announced in the last 18 months, and nearly in every U.S. state. The top industries for the spending have been electric vehicles with over $20 billion, batteries over $75 billion, solar over $13 billion, and offshore wind over $3 billion. Essentially, we believe that the resources and the policies under these pieces of legislation will reduce U.S. greenhouse gas emissions by 40% below 2005 levels by 2030, which gets us roughly 80% of the way there. And we project a 1 gigaton annual reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. So essentially, we feel like this really puts us on the path. And again, we need to collaborate with many others around the world, and I'm happy to talk about that in the subsequent conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'll go over, if I may, to Gerd Müller and ask you how UNIDO is supporting green industry in general and renewables-based industry in particular in its work, especially with countries in the Global South.
Thank you so much. UNIDO is the Industrial Development Organization of the UN. We are a technical organization, and our key priority is bring technologies, innovations, and investments from industrialized countries into LDCs and developing countries. We must see and we must know 2/3 of all people in the world are living in development and countries. That is the situation. And let's have a look in the future, forwards. How will the world look like 2050, 50 in general? Because of the population growth, every year the population growth is about 80 million. And still now, as we know, about 1 billion people do not have access to electricity. And because of this population growth, and of course the situation in developing countries, by 2050 we need an increase in the sector of food, and that means industrialization, that means energy, because precondition for every development is energy. And that means by 2050, we will have an increase of energy by 70%. Which kind of energy? And that is the key question. 4 key questions about this. The main question, and UNIDO is the technical partner for the developing countries. The main question is how to decouple economic growth from growing emissions. So there we need an answer, and the answer is innovation. Today, that was not discussed here. We have to be realistic. Renewables only for the next future, the next 10 or 20 years, is wishful. We work for this, but it's not realistic. Still today, 80% of energy production is fossil-based in India, in Nigeria, or 2 countries. And so, therefore, the question is, what contribution can renewables and hydrogen, for example, realistically make? That is, we have to give an answer. And there we have to be technology open for carbon capture, CCS, CCU, and so on. And what is really clear, these global challenges need global solutions. And the G20 states, they are responsible for 80% of the CO2 emissions. So ADC and DC, they are hit hardest by the consequences of climate change, and they are not responsible for this. And therefore, industrialized countries, they must fulfill their commitment. And that is what does it mean? That means investments in infrastructure, in innovation. And as we know, only 3% of all investments in the renewable energy market, only 3% is going into developing countries. So, and that we must change in every case.
May I ask you just very briefly, because you talked about technology transfer as crucial, to just say a word about what UNIDO can do in that area? And I'm thinking in particular, last summer you issued a global call on clean and smart energy. You invited entrepreneurs to submit their ideas for innovative solutions. How does your organization help the winners? How does that promote the kind of technology transfer you're talking about?
So we are a agency. We have 172 member states. We have offices in all continents and about 1,200 different projects. With these projects, we bring partnership, we bring investments and innovations, state of the art. A new decision the last few weeks with China and Ethiopia, we decided to invest in a center of excellence, state of the art. In Addis Ababa, the next few years, we will establish the center in the sector of digitalization, renewable energies, hydrogen, and agrotech together. Combined, a center of excellence, because we do have the knowledge, we do have the technologies. What is missing to come to a solution in the sector of sustainable energy, in the sector of end hunger, job creation? What is missing? Not the technology, not the knowledge, because of internet, everything is available. Missing is the political will. Look, our discussion, we invest in military worldwide, 2,200 billion, increasing in military. And what is decreasing? The investment in development aid. in cooperation with development countries. Not only 10% is the investment share compared with the military budget. To come to peace, we need investment to end hunger, access for energy for all. And that is even the message of this Congress today, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Monsieur Pogam, the WTO has drawn attention to the fact that the kind of changes we're talking about, boosting renewables, driving a green reindustrialization, will have major effects on trade patterns. What trade policies do you think are vital to ensure that this energy transition and industrial transition are also global, just, and equitable?
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for the question, because when I'm looking at the driver which appears on the screen here, I don't see trade. But it's beating around the bush. I see international cooperation, new markets, innovation. And this is exactly the point. Trade policies can leverage the transition in very different ways. And we have published a booklet about trade tools for climate change, which shows you that from trade finance, government procurement, and more traditional trade policies, we can do that. So let me take two examples, which are the old-fashioned examples of trade policy. One is good old tariffs. Tariffs can be lowered to accelerate the transition toward a low carbon economy or clean energy economy. And our members have been, part of our members have been looking at that, and they identified the list of products, and this is very basic, where you can just lower your tariffs. Sometimes it's 12%, wind turbines, others, just to accelerate that transition. So that's example number one. Subsidies. Old-fashioned tool also. Do you have an idea how much represent the fossil fuel subsidies in the world? It is $1,400 million, $1.4 trillion. Do you have an idea of trade distorting subsidies in agriculture, which part of them involve energy subsidies? 400. So we are looking to 1,800 million of fiscal resources which are used against the fight for the transition. So this is a type of thing that can be repurposed and used as to use fiscal leverage and finance is one of the words here, to boost this transition. We have some of our members, 50 of them approximately, who have started a discussion on reform of fossil fuel subsidies. This is a type of thing where trade policy can immensely help and support the work which is going on.
And how can the WTO itself support its members as they move along this energy industrial transition journey? What can you do concretely?
Well, the first thing that needs to be understood, and this is why the word is that trade was not part of the picture in climate policies or energy policies. And we have to all understand that the global objectives of the planet will not be achieved without an efficient trading system. So the first thing is to make sure that the system is not being broken, because specialization leads to economies of scale, support to innovation, and acceleration, dissemination of good technologies, and all that. And we kind of detect some signs of fragmentations, because all the environmental policies which are being pursued without consideration of their trade consequences, which is something that can be discussed within the WTO. I'm talking about, for instance, carbon pricing schemes, more than 73 in the world. Subsidies, mentioned before, subsidies with local content can be an issue of concern for the world trading system. Standards, proliferation of standards which are not interoperable, that's another problem. And all this is not a problem only for trade, it's also a problem in the fight against climate change, and the clean energy transition is part of it. So we are trying to advocate this at the WTO Secretariat. We proposed research project, knowledge products. And we have been also advocating for a trade day at the last COP, and for the first time it happened. So we tried to connect the dots between all these different policies which are not talking to each other. And the last thing that we can do is, of course, leverage this power of trade policy to accelerate the dissemination of good technologies.
Thank you very much. Let me go now to Ms. Bate. And South Africa is on a challenging transformation path. One of your country's main sources of comparative advantage in the past has been abundant, cheap coal-fired electricity. So how is your office supporting the switch from coal to renewables in both the energy and industrial sectors?
Thanks, and that's such a critical question in the South African context. And South Africa, so the high carbon content of our electricity sector has an enormous risk for our export product going forward, which is why it's critical that we transition the electricity sector. However, if we look at some of the biggest emitters in the country, they are dependent on coal as the source for our chemical industries. We look at Sasol as an example. So there's a significant heavy industrial user base that is not reliant on dirty electricity, but on heat sources that are also from coal. And that's where the transition opportunity becomes very interesting. We have not only abundant coal resources, we have some of the highest irradiation potential in the world. We have significant wind resources. We're sitting on a significant proportion of critical minerals necessary for the battery mineral value chain, and the PGMs necessary for fuel cell and electrolyzer production. So we continue to have all of the ingredients necessary to be a low energy generator to support industrialization. What we're sitting with as well is an energy crisis with a significant load shedding that has resulted in a very high level of deindustrialization over the last decade. So a transition away from coal, or a transition into cleaner energies, because the coal transition is a 25-year transition. It's not an overnight transition. The industrial transition that is necessary in order to ensure that our economy isn't impacted by CBAM and other policy changes globally is about...
Let's just remind everybody, carbon border adjustment mechanism.
Carbon border adjustment mechanism,
the
yes.
corollary of CO2 pricing.
Correct, yes. So we're very conscious about the reindustrialization opportunity that exists through green hydrogen and renewable energy for commercial and industrial users. So what we've seen over the last decade is the government program in renewable energy, which has seen 5 gigawatts coming onto the grid. And that's a private sector participation program for generating renewable energy. We're now moving into the commercial and industrial user space, so we're seeing more and more mines and large energy users transitioning to their own renewable energy generation. And green hydrogen is a critical component of decarbonization of heavy industry. So from an IDC perspective, we have been leading the green hydrogen commercialization strategy on behalf of our Department of Trade and Industry. And we see the green hydrogen opportunity not as an energy vector, but as an industrial pathway. So it is essential for the decarbonization of existing heavy industry to allow our chemicals industry, our steel industry to remain globally competitive. And we also see it as a key feeder into a green agricultural opportunity. So green ammonia for fertilizer, we've got the other competitive advantage South Africa has is expansive tracts of land for the agricultural sector. So we from an IDC perspective, we are working on an ecosystem approach, so nodal development, thinking about not a green hydrogen project or a mine, but how do we develop regions to ensure that they are inclusive and green and globally competitive? And I think maybe one last thing, I think that the innovation remains wide open. So we are very conscious of the need for partners in this transition so that we can lock into those global supply chains. I mean, so just looking at 2 of the words there, cooperation, innovation jump out. Because it is innovation and cooperation that is going to develop our value chains and support our partners in their decarbonization journey.
Our audience can't see that yet, but we're going to reveal it to them very soon. Cooperation is fairly large. I'll just give that away. Mr. Mathur, let me come to you with thanks for your patience. Let me ask you, because you do have quite a broad overview of the solar industry across different regions, ranging from Scandinavia to the Caribbean, what do you consider to be the crucial elements of a public policy framework that incentivizes robust green industry?
Well, across our country member base, the key issue is creating demand for clean energy. That, in turn, begs the question, okay, so what do I do to help create that industry? So whether it's the Net Zero Industry Act of the EU or the Inflation Reduction Act of the US, these are ways in which the industry moves towards the development of clean energy. One of the key issues then is, how do I, if I'm not the US, if I'm not the EU, if I'm not, these countries, how do I get investments for this? And what I'd like to say is that what we have found helps most is guarantees. Not so much subsidies, but guarantees. Guarantees which help investors, global investors, move money into developing countries and help, therefore, give people the confidence that is needed for them to invest there. What we have found is, in business as usual, we will see solar demand going up by a factor of 3 by 2030. If electric vehicles and green hydrogen take off, it'll go up by a factor of 8. Geographical diversification is essential. Because without geographical diversification, what we'll have is industrial hubs that can become starved of supplies in case there is a supply disruption. And we see every year that supply disruption occurs. The short point is national policies matter, national circumstances matter, but creating demand that pushes the adoption of green energy is ultimately the way to go.
Thank you very much. Let us now reveal the result of the word cloud. So, can you see it, dear audience? Very good. And it's interesting because it's changed a lot as we've been watching it evolve. We had renewables at the very center in the beginning, which is not surprising, but they've become much smaller. What we see at the very center, interestingly enough, is innovation. With battery storage, slightly less, green hydrogen, system change, cooperation, and somewhere on there, global CO2 pricing. But the operative word in that phrase, in my opinion, is global. Anyway, very interesting. I encourage you to weave it into your answers if you like. Otherwise, we'll talk about it at the very end. But I would like to take a deeper dive now on some of the challenges and trade-offs associated with actions to boost green industry. And again, if I may start with you, Ms. Lokman, what are the implications of the IRA outside the US? And I say that as an American journalist based in Europe, where there has been quite a bit of concern about diversion of investment out of Europe, not only out of China, but out of Europe toward the US. So what's your response to those concerns also?
Thank you very much for that question. What our intent and hope is that the IRA and the other legislation that I mentioned catalyzes the global development. We heard innovation is necessary, and in addition, we need prices to come down for certain technologies for them to be available more globally. And that's precisely what we're hoping a result of the IRA will be. These are massive investments going in the US, which will help spur innovation And that investment will spur innovation, and then the scale of it can bring down cost over time and make them more readily deployable around the world. So we believe actually that these investments in the US can catalyze trillions of dollars of investment globally. We also believe that the cost for some of these technologies this decade could come down as much as 25%. And in addition, we're working directly with other governments and partners and allies around the world, sharing our experiences and our approaches and looking at the regulatory and legal frameworks that are most important to attracting the investment that is required around the world.
Can you give a concrete example of the kind of cooperation that you do undertake to support development of clean energy industries in other countries?
So I think one particularly important aspect of the clean energy revolution, if you will, is the need for critical minerals and materials. And we don't have the transition if we don't have those products. And so this is one area where we have very deliberately created a cooperation mechanism called the Mineral Security Partnership. And this was launched a bit over a year ago. We've got 15 partners in that. And the idea is to work with the private sector and work with the mineral producing countries to focus both public and private investment on specific projects. And projects that will follow high ESG standards in those countries, benefiting the local communities and developing more of the supply chain in those countries. So looking, for example, at battery development in a cooperative project with Zambia and the DRC. So that's the kind of effort we think is important.
Thank you. Very interesting. Mr. Pogam, I'd be interested in getting your take on the same issue, essentially, whether the push to support robust green industries domestically could become an industrial policy race that only the wealthiest nations can win.
Well, I think you're right. There is for every country a natural tension between different sets of policies. One are industrial policies, jobs, national security, independence, sustainability, which is another one, and your trade. And you need, every country needs to see where they put the needle between at least the two sets of policies. Because if you go too far on industrial policy and national security, then you may fail on your sustainability objective because your technology might be unadapted or too expensive. Now, if you move to the global scenery and you just worsen up, because there is a lot of anxiety which is created by these uncoordinated policies. So, for instance, developing countries are very anxious about the risk of being wiped out of the market, of the green market, by subsidies from the North countries, and then later on locked in by intellectual property against them. And if you look at developed countries, most of them, I think, US, EU, are very scared of not having a level playing field with China, with highly subsidized industries. So all this is creating tensions which are not inducing cooperation. So what we have seen at the WTO is that this conversation needs to take place. We have had a ministerial meeting recently, and there was a conversation about sustainability, industrial policy, and policy space. And it was really fascinating to see the vast majority of our members have some level of discomfort with the way the trading system now operates, because there is no space for this cooperative dialogue. So we need to foster that. I think that's a first step.
Just very briefly, because we do see global CO2 pricing on here, in the absence of a global CO2 price, which of course has been pretty much impossible to get so far, countries are resorting to carbon adjustment, border adjustment mechanisms. What's the WTO view on that?
Well, we have two compasses on this one. The WTO mantra, law, and the prophet, as we would say, is non-discrimination. So this is the best way to achieve your industrial policy and all that. And the carbon pricing can be designed in a non-discriminatory manner, like any trade policy. The second element is more political, is about just transition, which refers to the anxiety of developing countries that I was referring to. And I think the technology transfer answer that my neighbor was mentioning is key here. And there is a certain level of anticipation of how to organize technology transfer to promote accessibility of the green technologies in advance. That should be part of the strategic thinking of multinationals and also the government which support them.
Let me go over to Mr. Müller, if I may, and for you as well, if you would like to address the point about trade and whether we run the risk that we see an industrial policy race that becomes, in essence, protectionism. Speak to that if you wish, but I have a second question as well. So shall I do the second one as well now, or would you rather speak to the other first?
Thank you. Thank you. We have to think globally, and the approach must be global. And WTO, we have an open worldwide market for goods, for products, for energy production, for minerals, but we do not have standards, global standards, accepted standards in the production and in the processing industry. And that is what is UNIDO, we prioritize this question. We must agree about global standards in the production, in the global value chains. Look at the sector, and Minister Habeck started with UNIDO to get an international initiative in this. But that is not enough. We need the European Union, we need WTO and all organizations. Let me only short mention the question of, everybody talks about sustainability. What is sustainability? Sustainability means we must agree about global standards. And what is sustainability in the green mineral production, for example?
That was my second question.
A green transition is only possible on the basis of green resources, green minerals. And what is the situation in the green mineral production worldwide? 80% are so-called artisanal mining sectors. No standards, no social, no environmental standard, nothing at all. And therefore, you ask me, what is the role of UNIDO? We started a global initiative, a global alliance for responsible mining. Without green minerals, no green transition. And the green minerals, who is the owner? Where are the resources? That is a big chance in the developing countries. The owner, the resources are in Africa and Latin American countries. But the big companies like Rio Tinto, Glencore, two of them, they must agree about global standards, minimum standards, and local added value for Sierra Leone, for African countries, for the people there. That is what we are working, and we ask for a global alliance in this sector that is so important for the developing countries.
And we do see standardization. Thank you very much. We see standardization on here. It's not written in big print, but it is on there. And so is value chain cooperation. And what you're discussing, of course, includes value chain accountability, as it were. Let me go over to Ms. Bate, and a related question to you, if I may. South Africa is, of course, one of the BRICS countries. It's the gateway to the African continent with its very rich mineral deposits. And you're geographically central on the trade routes that lead from Asia to Europe. So how do you aim to feed industrial growth in a socially sustainable way as you're making this important transition?
Thanks, and I'm really glad that the social agenda is on the table. I feel like so much attention has been given to environmental. And if you think about sustainability, it has to be about inclusive and green transition. And from an African perspective, what we have seen is far too much of Africa's minerals exported for beneficiation elsewhere, with little impact on the African continent. So from a regional value chain perspective, and both green hydrogen, I'll speak specifically to green hydrogen and critical minerals in the context of critical minerals being a critical element into decarbonization pathways, and hydrogen is one of those opportunities for decarbonization of our heavy industry. So looking at both of those, we're looking at regional value chains. So considering hydrogen around the Capes in South Africa up to Namibia and Angola, and then critical minerals across the SADC and broader African region. And really looking at how we can. So the critical minerals is a bidirectional strategy, just ensuring that we move from battery assembly, high value add, down to precursor materials, recognizing that there's very few precursor manufacturers outside of China, and then also the mining up to precursor. And why I mention the whole value chain is that none of that is possible. We keep talking about financing being the constraint. There's lots of money available. What we're lacking is the skills, the right skills, to actually unlock the industrial pathways necessary to drive the transition. And that is where it becomes an inclusive opportunity. So it really is about ensuring that we develop the trade and professional skills necessary to unlock the pathways. Those skills need to be developed within the region and communities where the skills will be utilized within the value chains. And it is a value chain focus. It's no longer about unlocking a mine in the Northern Cape. So I'm going to use the Northern Cape as an example where our critical minerals and hydrogen converge. We're thinking about the development of the right skills to deploy renewable energy, which forms the backbone of green hydrogen and green mines. Then looking at the mines as being a living community. So how can we think about the agricultural value-add production leveraging off the green ammonia for green agriculture, agrophovoltaic as a potential that creates sustainable livelihoods for communities that incidentally mine for the life of the resource. And it's looking at moving, there's a focus on Gauteng, which is an urban area, and that's a decarbonization objective. But where it comes to the poorer, underdeveloped provinces, so a province like the Northern Cape, where there's expansive tracts of lands, enormous irradiation potential, enormous battery minerals, it presents not an opportunity for evacuation of product for production in the Vaal region, but really about the growth of industrial opportunities and jobs for communities in the Northern Cape. So we really are focused on development by intent as opposed to development by accident.
Thank you very much. And then if I can go to Mr. Mathur and pick up on something that you said in your first answer. You talked about a broadly based, geographically diversified drive toward green industries. In some ways, that seems to contravene something that is being heard more and more in many places in the global north, namely that we need to onshore, reshore clean energy production, solar, even production of PV, for example, because that is what boosts resilience and economic security. What do you say to that?
May I say that this is really dependent on demand? We will see more and more production happening based on two things. One, it is close to demand. And the second is it depends on how large is the product which needs to be transported over distances. So for example, if you're looking at wind turbines and you're looking at the blades of wind turbines, those are expensive to transport. So you will see them being made near the area where they're used. On the other hand, you look at solar cells. Solar cells are, what, 150 microns thick? It's very easy to transport solar cells. However, solar modules is much more difficult. So what we will see is solar cell to solar modules being produced globally. Now, the issue is, what about solar cell manufacturing? Solar cell manufacturing is something which is very, very dependent on scales. Production will depend on how large it can be. We have seen that China has invested a huge bit in it. Companies have invested. In fact, some people say there's an overinvestment. Consequently, any country which will go in for cell manufacture will have to provide the kind of incentives that are being provided by the Inflation Reduction Act in the US or the performance-linked scheme in India, and so on. What it implies is that cell manufacturing will occur at a lot fewer places, but cell to module will occur in a lot more places. In a very real sense, I come back to where I started. It is about demand. Creating demand is about creating those manufacturing capabilities across the world. And the only thing that will help money move is guarantees. So guarantees and demand are the two sides of the coin which will determine where various production facilities are set up.
Thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes left, which is comfortable, at least given the kind of squeeze we've had in most of our other panels. Let me ask us to take a look one more time at the word cloud. Can we get that up for the audience as well, in case it's gone down, so that you can see it? And I'd like to ask all of you to just pick out whatever you consider most important here and say a few more words about it. So looking at a robust green industrial sector worldwide as the goal, and not a race between countries, essentially a zero-sum game, but a worldwide win-win game. What do you think is most important here? What are the key steps? Straight down the panel, please.
So thank you. When I look at the board here, two things pop out for me: the secure supply chains and the value chain cooperation. And I know we've talked about that here, but we have certainly seen examples of when we have been overly reliant on one or just a few suppliers of critical inputs to our economies. And we have also seen what happens in terms of the disparities in wealth and development across the world when you have concentrated not only extraction, but then processing in, again, just a handful of countries. So those are two issues we really need to continue to deal with. And so diversifying our supply chains and creating, and we've talked about this quite a bit, creating those value chains within a multitude of regions and countries will lead to greater security and economic prosperity, social prosperity as well.
It occurs to me that in green hydrogen, with the plethora of potential sources, we heard a Latin American panel where essentially everybody there was determined to be, the next big green hydrogen, that at least there we will not have the problems of sole supplier reliance, most likely, that we've seen on fossil fuels.
Well, and that is true, but then I think that goes back to the demand question. You have to figure out with the hydrogen market, this is so new and we're all trying to wrap our arms around it, but what are the drivers of demand and which industries? Is the hard to abate industries in particular? Is it an additional component in power production? Kind of what is that driver of demand and where is it coming from and what are the economics to supply it? How far does it make sense to transport? To transport from Latin America to Asia, for example. All of that remains to be figured out in large part. So I think at this point, creating that demand, which we're trying to do under the IRA, you've seen the hubs, the hydrogen hubs that the Department of Energy is funding. So we have several around the country, and those are attempting to sort of test some of this, creating local networks of supply and demand and see how that works.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Gert Müller to talk next about whatever strikes you as most important here before you need to leave us, because I know you have to go soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. Peace. Peace.
Peace.
Yes. Without development, without jobs for hundreds of millions of Africans, but even Latin Americans, last week, there was the vice president from Bolivia, from Ecuador, the foreign minister, and so on in my office. But let's look again to the African continent, close to Europe. This continent will double its population until 2050. We all are still alive, hopefully, there. Double. That means still now 600 million people in the African countries do not have access to energy. Now look to 2050, additional to 1.2, 1.5 billion people will come born. So that means this continent needs access to electricity for 2 billion people within the next 30 years. Without this, there's no development, no jobs, no education, no computer, no health infrastructure. What will be the consequence of such a situation for this continent? Think about this. No peace. Therefore, when we talk about energy transition, that is the most important issue. The first priority, not bring energy. We talked about this. That's interesting. Bring energy resources like hydrogen from Namibia, from African countries to Europe, to US. That is not the first priority. The first priority, production of energy in Africa for African people. And then it is possible to start industrialization, job creation, and that brings peace to these societies. And that is so important for the world. That is even the solution for the refugee crisis and so on and so on. Therefore, thank you, think globally. Don't think only at your own country and our own continent. This 10% of the industrialized, of the rich, we have to take responsibility in a much greater sense than it is now.
Thank you very much. You have to leave us to get a train, but we're going to give you a round of applause for that wonderful answer. Thank you very much. And may I just hold you here 10 minutes longer, dear panel, because we're not quite finished, and I do want to hear the thoughts of those who are still with us. But truly, Mr. Müller, feel free to go. Mr. Paugam, your take on what you consider here most important and why.
Well, thank you. I'll quickly pick 3 points. International cooperation, you will not be surprised, but we are at a defining moment. It's just like a prisoner's dilemma. Either we cooperate and we will achieve our objectives, or we don't cooperate and we will have a suboptimal outcome one way or another. So we need to think about that. Global CO2 pricing, I think this is the ideal, the long-term ideal. It does not mean single CO2 prices, by the way. Yep. You'll just be interested to know that the WTO has steered task force, interagency task force with OECD, World Bank, IMF, to try to start to, and they have started working on this. The third one is a little small here. It has been mentioned by several panelists, is standardization. I think this is 50% of the solution in the world trade system. Does not mean that it is an easy solution. It's long, but we are working closely with international standard organization. For instance, in the steel sector, we try to help them converge around the idea of what is green steel. And inside this standardization, you have a small issue that would deserve much more it could be a low-hanging fruit, is calculation methodologies for carbon emission. For example, if you take the steel sector, 1 ton of steel in California does not have the same content of carbon than in Europe, just because of the calculation methodology. So we should be able to converge on this, because at the end of the day, it will determine the fluidity of all this transition.
Thank you very much indeed. Ms. Bate.
Thanks. The word I'm going to look at is innovation, and I think from 3 perspectives. One, mindset. The mindset that has got us to where we are today is not going to take us into the future. How can we think differently about solutions, funding, cooperation, participation, and collectively building a green world? 2, from a new technology perspective, I mean, what we've seen in green hydrogen, technological advancements over the last 3 years has been phenomenal. And I think it will fundamentally change the potential for use cases in hydrogen. Similarly with new energy vehicles or alternative energy vehicles. So the world of innovation in technology and the technologies of the future is wide open, which again requires a different thinking in how we actually fund these opportunities when proven technology is not a given. And then thirdly, from an information technology perspective, how do we, in the context of standards and standardization, leverage technology to ensure that we can validate immediately the green content of the molecule, the product, the export that's driven? It'll create enormous efficiency in global trade, and will also create enormous certainty for both off-takers and producer countries.
Thank you very much. And finally, last word to you, Ajay Mathur.
I'm going to follow Ms. Bates and agree with all of you that innovation is the most important thing. And like Ms. Bates, I'd like to expand this word. And what I'll add to what you said was, let's also look at business models. Because business models change according to whether you are an OECD country where there's adequate amount of electricity supply, or whether you are a country where a huge amount of electricity supply has yet to develop, or whether you are a country where lots of people don't even have access to electricity, or whether you're a small island state where, for example, solar boats become important. So innovation needs smart policy making. The second thing which it needs is cooperation. As I said, there are at least these 4 groups of countries. It makes great sense for them to cooperate with each other, learn from each other, look at the best practices that they have. At the end of the day, what matters is whether I am able to meet my national goals, whether they are providing jobs to people, whether it is about ensuring that I retain my industrial competitiveness, whether it is about most of my domestic needs, industrial and or residential, are met by my local energy production, or whether I am a net exporter of energy. Countries will decide what makes sense. And I think innovation is the key to it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. This has been a very, very interesting discussion. Shall we give them a warm round of applause for all that they have